Our next speaker is Pagano. He teaches middle school religion at St. Joseph Catholic School in Marietta. And last night Dave spoke to us about the joy of the gospel, which was something that Pier Giorgio lived out very fully. Despite being a layperson, he died, I think, at the age of 24, so he was a student his whole life. He had this tremendous joy because he knew Christ very deeply. And that was fueled by his love and devotion for the Eucharist. And so Austin is going to be speaking to us about that.
Right. Well, Dan, thank you for asking me and letting me come and talk with you guys. It was really great, I'd say a very humbling and great honor to be asked. And when I thought about 40 minutes, I think you said roughly, and that seemed like such a very long time, 40 minutes. So I will share everything that I know, that I've learned, and that I looked up, and we won't quite get to 40 minutes, but we'll try to get close. It was very good for me just to kind of reflect on prayer, because there's so many things that we do that sometimes, how often do we reflect on, what am I doing? Right? Like, what is the deeper meaning, right? Life in general, right? Like, we're all on this journey of life, and we're trying to go deeper and deeper on understanding of life. So I thought it'd be good to just start with prayer. And what is prayer? Okay, a secular definition, and I love doing this. I don't know if you guys do this, but with being a teacher and having a lot of students that want to debate what words mean, you just look up the dictionary definition of a word, right? And sometimes there's a couple different definitions or a slight variation of definitions. So a secular definition, which we could probably identify with as well for prayer, would be an earnest hope. So I thought that was interesting. The late Pope Benedict that just passed away, he had an encyclical where he talks about the interchangeability of those two words, faith and hope, and how they really mean the same thing, faith and hope, right? And why is that? Because we're people, as Christians, this is not our home, right? Heaven is our home. And so we are looking to faith and hope in heaven, right? St. Paul talks about how faith, hope, and love, these three, the greatest of these is love. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. And the greatest of these is love, because love is the only one that remains in heaven. There's no more faith, there's no more hope in heaven, right? Those are things for this life. And so too, the same would have been true before the fall, that there would be no faith and no hope. It was more just the love, right? So that's a secular definition. One of being a middle school teacher maybe doesn't sound impressive. For me though, having done it, this is my fourth year, is a lot harder than I would have thought. So I don't know, are any of you guys teachers? We have any teachers here? We have a few. Okay, so wow, it's a lot harder than I would have realized that it was going to be. So and you have to learn a lot, a lot more than, or maybe I just didn't know as much as I thought I did. Well, maybe a little bit of both. But in our book, our small textbook that we have, one of the definitions for prayer is, and you may have heard this before, is the lifting up of the mind and the heart to God. So prayer is the lifting up, the kind of offering up of the mind and the heart to God. And it really is the life of the new heart, as the Catechism talks about it. It's an offering. Let's think about offering. And so this is very connected with Mass. This is really the epitome of prayer for us. And it is the most valuable thing that we do. If you think about a tragedy that happens, if somebody passes away, what do? Right? People go, I remember 9/11. I don't know if you guys remember 9/11, like everybody left school, left probably work, and we went to church and we prayed, right? Or if somebody passes away, what do? You go to church. And now that's because it's the only thing that we can do, right? What else can you do? If somebody's in need, you usually say, what can I do to help you, right? And sometimes people just say, pray for me. Sometimes people say that. But if someone's passed away, there's nothing else you can do for the person but pray, right? So sometimes it's the only thing that we can do, but it's also the most important thing that we can do. Right? And it's connected to God, and it's this beautiful connection with faith, because sometimes people say, well, what good did my prayers even do? I don't even know, right? Like there's a faith element of even believing that the prayers did something, right? It's a very kind of mysterious, mystical, beautiful thing. So it's very, very connected with faith. And this is all assuming, right? Like we're starting from the place of believing God exists, right? Because if God doesn't exist, right, then what's the value to prayer, right? If you talk to an atheist, they'd say, well, there's no value. You're not talking to anyone, right? Nothing God can do for you if he doesn't exist. So it's somewhere in this range between, some people would say they don't think that prayer has value, but for us who believe in God, we would say, well, it's the most valuable thing that you can do, right? It's the most valuable thing. So that's what we believe. The most valuable thing that you can do. And sometimes the only thing that you can do. And so what is something that's the most important? We would say something that's the most important, it's the most essential, it's the most foundational, it's the most valuable. So those words are all synonymous. So if you think about things that are really most foundational, they're most basic. We so often, out of pride, and this happens to me all the time where I try to skip steps, and what happens when you do that is you can lose your footing. I don't know, I'm a terrible dancer. If any of you guys are dancers, the first thing you do is you learn the basics, right? You learn the footworks. And if you don't know that, you look at Michael Jordan, if you look at, some Tiger Woods, probably, I don't know, tennis too much, who's Roger Federer, or some of these really excellent athletes or painters, right? They have the basics down. If they don't have the basics down, then they can't go anywhere, right? So you have to have the basics down first, and the same is true for faith. Okay, so here's a quote from Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and I think this is in the Catechism. Nothing is equal to prayer, for what is impossible, it makes possible. What is difficult, easy. For it is impossible, utterly impossible, for the man who prays eagerly and invokes God ceaselessly, ever to sin. Those who pray are certainly saved. Those who do not pray are certainly damned. And so prayer for us is the most important thing that we can do. There's lots of different forms or kinds of expressions of prayer. There's lots of different ways we talk about it. For expression, sometimes we talk about vocal prayer, or meditative prayer, or contemplative prayer. There's different impressions of prayer. That would be, often we talk about the acts, adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, supplication. Interestingly, to go back to that aspect of before the fall, there would be no need for supplication prayers. Right? Adam wouldn't have no need for supplication prayers or contrition prayers. Before sin, what do we have to be contrite about? Right? What do we have to ask God for if you already have everything? Right? So adoration I'll talk about that in a second. Adoration is really the beginning of prayer. And so what's another way that we can look at prayer? We can talk about, we do this sometimes, we break things up into different kinds of things. There's obligatory prayer and non-obligatory prayer. So obligatory prayer would be Mass, right? So we just had a nice prayer of the morning prayer, right? That's non-obligatory prayer. Unless you're a priest or a nun, or you made a commitment, or a deacon, you made a commitment to pray it. It's a beautiful prayer, but it's a non-obligatory prayer, right? The Rosary is we have lots of different devotional prayers, Divine Mercy Chaplet, the Rosary, Novenas, lots of beautiful traditions of prayer. But those would not be obligatory prayers. The Mass is our obligatory prayer, right? And I think that you can see the importance. So often we can do the minimal. Daily Mass is another example, right? Of not something that's non-obligatory. And I think that if you see the beauty of the power of it, if you imagine, or if you think about a time in your life where if you weren't going to Mass, if you take out that obligatory aspect, you can see what a huge difference it makes. It can be sometimes harder to tell, right, when you're going above and beyond, right? But I think you can really see it if you take away the obligatory aspect, right? In other words, maybe you could look at the civil society. If people didn't pay their taxes, right? That's the obligatory aspect. If they didn't pay their taxes, well, what happened to our society, right? If people didn't go to Mass, what would happen to the church? And there are a lot of people that don't go to church. But if nobody went to church on Sunday, how small would the churches be, right? How much smaller? So for us, when we're talking about, especially Eucharistic adoration, right, this is something that is going above and beyond, right? This is our prayer. This is us kind of pursuing God at deeper levels. And I think part of this, it comes back to faith of when you're talking about going above and beyond, am I losing something, right? So if you're being a maximalist or a minimalist at something, right, do you believe, am I losing something when I make a sacrifice? If I tithe, right, do I have less money, or am I really benefiting, gaining more from this? Is this something where I'm losing or am I gaining? And that's where the faith comes in, that we believe that we are gaining. And we need people to be committed, right? Committed to prayer. A great example of this, so you talk about Eucharistic adoration or Mass. If you talk about Mass, you need a priest, right? You need a priest committed to not just being a priest, but committed to saying Mass at a particular time, right? So that you can have that Mass people can go to. We can choose different Mass times if I want to go at 6 p.m. or the Saturday night or in the morning. We can have that flexibility, but you need to have a priest committed to being there. The same is true of Eucharistic adoration. It's nice to be able to go in the chapel for whatever amount of time, whenever you want, if you have a 24/7 adoration chapel, but you have to have people committed to certain times of being there in order that that's available that you can even do that, right? So we have that with people just like we do with actions, that you have this necessary obligation. You need obligations, and you need somebody fulfilling obligations so that you can have these good things in life. Okay, so if we compare if you think about the body and the soul, and you think about the soul with prayer and the spiritual world and this most essential thing, what is it juxtaposed? What is it compared or contrasted with in the body? And that would be money, right? Things of value. Money, I heard an interesting description of money and why people like it, or why I find it's valuable. It's because it's the most convertible resource. It's not about the green paper itself. I don't know if any of us know what it's made out of. I don't know if anyone know what our current money's made out of.
There's some content.
It's a type of linen, actually, not actual paper.
That's very fascinating. Okay. But at the end of the day, whatever type of linen it is, I'm sure it's not that people like the linen, right? Yeah. And so it's convertible to different things. And some people, I don't know if you're like me, but I don't really spend money very much, right? But it's nice to have it in case you needed it. For a medical emergency, for security, if I lose my job, I have money, so I don't have to worry about it, right? And so the problem can be that we can start looking to it, right? And this is where it kind of comes to the love of money. We can kind of rely on it too much. We can kind of treat it like, put our hope and our faith in it instead of God, right? I always find it interesting, you talk about gambling or the lottery, they have these big, somebody asked me just the other day if I was buying a lottery ticket for these big lottos. And I'd rather win a small lottery than a big lottery. If somebody just handed you a check all of a sudden for $1 billion, I don't think that would be good for most people. Whereas a smaller sum, like a big bonus that you get at a job, it'd be like, well, I can handle that. I'm not going to quit my job immediately. But if you've ever been around gambling, it can be this thing where people are putting their hope, and it's kind of like, we have these problems in life, and if I can just win this lottery, it solves all of my problems, right? But it doesn't. It doesn't solve all of our problems, right? Because our biggest problem is death, and no amount of money is going to change that, right? A couple of interesting things, I think about that. One, I heard an interesting anecdote about Warren Buffett, and a very wealthy person. He's, I think, 91 years old, and somebody said, okay, if you would you trade your net worth for Warren Buffett's worth? And most people would be like, well, sure, especially if I have a lower net worth. But if you also had to trade or change ages with him. So would you swap with net worths and ages, right? And most people would be like, well, I don't know, what good is the money if I'm not going to live very long, right? And so it shows you that clearly money is not the most valuable thing. When people, and interestingly with sin, right, you think about what are people really doing when they sin? They're basically taking something of value, right, of lesser value, something of finite value, and they're, this whole idea of selling your soul to the devil, when people talk about that, they're exchanging something that's infinitely valuable, their soul, for something of finite value, right? And the devil will, throughout life, he tries to, which is really very sad, right? And the devil will try to tempt people with more and more and more. He comes back and he says, okay, you won't do it for this, but what if you get this, right? And so he tries to do that. So there are these things of temporal value that are clearly not what life's about, right? Clearly not the most important things in life. It's a part of life, but it's not the most important thing in life. So why do we have these issues? Why do we have this maybe tension between, think about sacrificing money. Sometimes I think about, when you give money to a poor person, right? You might think for a second, oh, look what a great person I am. I gave money to someone, I did something good. But the reality is you benefit more from that. You're giving something temporal to them, and they're probably going to be hungry again in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whereas you're getting something, an eternal reward. So you're benefiting more from that interchange, right? But we don't always, it's in giving that we receive, right? We really benefit more, but sometimes it's hard to see that. Why is that? Why is it that maybe it's hard sometimes to pray? I don't know about you guys, but I love to pray. I love to pray. But it's one of the things I find that's the hardest for me is to sometimes get myself into the chapel. And once I'm there, I'm doing great, but sometimes it can be hard just to get there. And part of the reason for that is our concupiscence, our fallenness, our inclination to sin, right? That remains from our original sin, even after that's been washed away through baptism and our forgiveness of sins. And that is something that will continue to remain with us until we die. So here's another definition of prayer. This is from Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. He said, prayer is the noble supplication with which we lift up to the throne of God. It is the most efficient means to obtain from God the graces which we need, and especially the strength of persevering in these times, in which the hatred of the sons of the devil is breaking out violently against the sheep who are faithful to the fold. In recommending heartfelt prayer to you, I'm including all the practices of piety, first of all, the Most Holy Eucharist. And so when we're talking about prayer, Eucharistic adoration, right, is really the focus. So we start with that, and then, so prayer is essential, it's important, and then we move into prayer of adoration of the Eucharist. The Catechism mentions adoration this way. Adoration is the first attitude of main acknowledging that he is a creature before his Creator. It exalts the greatness of the Lord who made us and the almighty power of the Savior, who sets us free from evil. Adoration is homage of the Spirit to the King of Glory, respectful silence in the presence of the new and ever greater God. Adoration of the thrice holy and sovereign God of love blends with humility and gives assurance to our supplications. Okay, so before talking about Eucharistic adoration a little bit, just kind of do a reflection about a short reflection of the sacraments. So what are the sacraments? The sacraments, we have our 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, Holy Eucharist, confession, anointing of the sick, holy orders, and matrimony. These are, what are these? These are just kind of important times in our natural life, right? They're important things. Baptism goes with birth. Anointing of the sick, not only for when you die, it used to be called last rites, but with death, right? It's associated with severe illness or potentially approaching death with death. Confirmation, kind of this adulthood, this moving towards out of adolescence. So the important moments of life, and we refer to their celebration in public as the liturgy, the public prayer of the church. That's what the sacraments are. And you can see today, there's a little, in the culture of death and violence, that the appreciation for the sacraments isn't quite what it used to be, right? So you think about baptism, you think about birth, right? A lot of people are not having kids, right, or having less kids. You think about marriage and the beauty of marriage, and a lot of people aren't getting married, right? That's another sacrament, matrimony. Going to Mass on Sundays. A lot of people don't go to Mass on Sundays, right? So you're seeing, unfortunately, this gravitation towards lesser goods or lack thereof. And again, this is kind of consistent with free will that exists and people misusing our free will in a world of fallenness where we have an inclination to sin. And sacraments are very connected with sacrifice, right? So what is sacrifice? It's holiness. The word, the etymological aspect of the word means to make holy, right? And the sacraments are connected with this Mass we refer to as the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And it reminds us of Jesus' sacrifice. And now what the temptation can be, and certainly as Americans, and America is not as much Catholic, as more Protestant Christian, right? And so a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters say, and I think even we would say, thank you to Jesus for the sacrifice he made, but that doesn't mean that I need to make the sacrifices because he made the sacrifices, right? So what's so very Catholic is this idea that I need to make sacrifices too in my pursuit of holiness and following after Jesus and carrying my cross, right? We live in a very consumeristic culture, very capitalist consumeristic, right? And the consumerist is doing what? It's not about sacrificing, right? It's about obtaining or gaining, right? It's the opposite of sacrificing. And so that's kind of the environment we're in. So that's an extra level of resistance on top of the resistance that we feel from our concupiscence, right? It kind of reinforces that we have to fight off to be extra cultural, countercultural, right? So the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, the Eucharist, is a mystery. It is a mystery like the Trinity, like God. We can't fully understand God, and we won't, right? And the Eucharist is similar to that, and that's okay. If we look back at something and say, I didn't really understand this when I was at such and such a time in my life. I didn't really understand what was going on, but now I understand. Well, do we really understand? No, we might have more understanding, right? But do we fully understand anything? Really, right? We fully understand anything? No. And so the Eucharist, we can have our understanding of what we believe. It's kind of like being perfect. We are not perfect. And so we're not going to have perfect knowledge, just like we are not going to be morally perfect, but we aim to be as good as we can. So what do we believe as Catholics? We believe that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. I don't know if you've ever had a friend that joked with you about being a cannibal. I've had a friend of mine that many years ago joked with me about being a cannibal. Maybe you have had that, okay? And you know, I didn't even quite know, this was a very long time ago, I didn't even quite know how to respond to it. Now, I probably would have, responded a little bit better. So I think I was just like, I don't think we are. Am I? I didn't think I was. I hope I'm not. Please don't tell anyone. But so we have had these Eucharistic miracles where the bread really does become actually the flesh of Jesus, right? And so, but it's to my understanding, and Father, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in those cases we would not consume, right, the Eucharistic miracle. I think that's true, yes, Father?
Yes.
That would be cannibalism, yes.
Own your stuff, man. It's yours.
So I remember reading about the miracle of Lanciano was, I think, in the 800s. And so there was a priest that was struggling with his belief in the Eucharist. And when he was saying Mass, the bread turned into flesh. And they had scientists that did research on this. And they saw, yeah, this really is true flesh. This is real, this is real. There have been some times when they've, even in recent years, I want to say Pope Francis even had a Eucharistic miracle that happened when he was cardinal in Argentina. And sometimes they'll look and they'll say, not only is this real flesh, this is heart flesh. And it's alive. And it's from the left ventricle or something like that, right? Left aorta of the heart. So we believe this is really true, right? We'll talk about it, the accidents of the bread. We can still see the bread, but the inside, right, after the consecration at Mass, Jesus becomes present. It goes from bread to Jesus fully present with the Eucharist can still taste like bread and look like bread, but we believe the inside. Think of it like your own conversion of heart. If you think about St. Paul is a great example, right? So you go from Paul to St. Paul, right? And he had this conversion. Maybe his skin color was the same, his hair color was the same. But inside, right, he was different. And you can notice this in yourself, if you've had a deep conversion, or even if you go through a period of time where you fall back into sin. And I don't know if I've had this happen to me where people will ask me and say, "Are you sick?" They'll say, "You look sick." I mean, people, even if they can tell, right, like they can know like what's going on the inside if you're different. For good, for better or for worse, right? They can tell. And so this is the same sort of belief that we have in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the most blessed sacrament because we believe Jesus is present, really, truly present in the Eucharist. And so it is, an interesting, I heard Dr. Scott Hahn talk about this, an interesting thing when you think about food is normally we eat food and the food becomes a part of us, right? But when we receive the Eucharist, it's the opposite. We become a part of the body of Jesus. And so it's a kind of a different nourishment that we're having, that we're receiving. It is the completion of, the Eucharist is the completion of the Christian initiation. There's a lot of sacraments you can live your entire life without receiving. You can live your entire life without being married or the sacrament of holy orders, or without being anointing of the sick, although, you should receive the sacraments. I know someone that was in his 60s that was never confirmed. He was baptized and was never confirmed, and you should be confirmed, but I guess there's no one that's checking to see if you've been confirmed. I mean, if you're baptized, you're a Christian, and you can be an active Catholic, right? So you have baptism, you have communion, you have confession. So those are really the sacraments that we receive on a regular basis, not baptism, but confession, hopefully, and Holy Communion on a regular basis, and at least once a year, we're supposed to be receiving those. But this thing about this initiation aspect, so it's this kind of idea of being and becoming. So this is like a philosophical concept it's interesting of this. We are the body of Christ, we are being the body of Christ, but we're also becoming the body of Christ. It's like if someone, I'm sure some of you are parents, and so if you're a mother or father, you are a mother or father, you are being a mother or father, but you're also becoming that, right? You're becoming the mother or father, right? It's this process. And so the same is true of us as Christians and as Catholics. We are Christians and Catholics, we're also continuing this process of becoming, right? We're being and becoming. And so we're growing closer and closer to God through this process. And the Eucharist is this nourishment for us. It's kind of like the desert experience of the ancient Israelites when they received the manna from heaven, right? It's this idea that It is our nourishment to get us through the desert. We're in a desert whether we realize it or not. It's a little bit of a different desert because we can step out of the desert at times, unfortunately, for better or for worse. But we are in a desert experience. So just another word about sacrifice. Sacrifice is connected with mercy. Another interesting comment for Pope Benedict, he had a way with words. If you guys ever read his encyclicals, he could use a sentence that, like with regular words, that just the combination of the words is like the most beautiful thing you've ever heard. And recently going over his explanation for what mercy and justice is. Justice, and you've probably heard of this before, justice is to give to another what they're due, what they're owed, to give another what is theirs, right? Justice to give to another what they're owed, what they're due, what is theirs. Mercy is to give to another what is mine. And that I thought was so beautiful. Mercy is to give to another what is mine. And so an example of this would be if you borrowed, borrowed $5 from someone, in justice, you should return it to them. Right? You give them the $5 back. That's justice. Justice is a virtue. It's a good thing. But mercy would be if you gave someone $5 of your money, right? If you gave someone some $5 of your money, there's extra beauty to that. So if someone, you think about mercy, if someone sinned against you, right? So they owe you maybe an apology, right? But you don't have to wait for them to apologize to forgive them. You can forgive them not only before, but regardless of whether they apologize, right? And when you're taking upon somebody's debt, right, you're taking on what is theirs, right? So just like you can give to another what is yours for good, right, as the sacrifice, you can take on what is on another that is bad on yourself, which is the same sort of idea. Pay somebody else's debt, which is what Jesus does for us. And mercy is this beautiful thing where there's no, it's this kind of very freeing thing where you have obligation, justice is an obligation, and then mercy is this extra. And it's like prayer. Do you pray for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours? You can pray for as long as you'd like. And that can be sometimes more difficult for those of us that are guided a little bit easier through the moral aspect of life. So mercy is to give to another what is mine. And this is really, mercy can be so difficult, right? It is so countercultural, and it is really what makes us is so Christian. Praying for enemies, loving, sacrificing for those that have hurt us rather than just those that love us or are neutral. The Good Samaritan reminds us of the enemies that the Jews and the Samaritans were, and that the Samaritans are still able to be there for the Jewish people. So if we're going to pray, and we know the importance of the Eucharist for us, the Eucharist also, it represents us as Catholics. It's so Christian, so Catholic because we believe Jesus is present, so we're going to worship Jesus. Some of the other beliefs that we have, praying to God the Father, it's not something that only Christians do, right? That's not a uniquely Christian thing, whereas worshiping and praying to Jesus is something uniquely Christian. And then in particular, if you look at the sacraments, the Holy Eucharist, which we get from the priesthood, right? It's a recognition of the church. And so Jesus working through the church. And so it's very Christian and it's very Catholic. And so it's a very particularly Catholic devotion. I've taken, I don't remember as a kid if anyone ever took me to pray in the chapel, but there's a lot of times when I've taken the students to pray in the chapel and they absolutely love it. It's actually surprised me for kids that sometimes have a difficulty being quiet for 2 minutes straight. They'll sit for 40 minutes in the chapel and be quiet and just love it, and it's really beautiful to see. And they'll complain about not going more often. Maybe they're just tired of hearing me speak, which is fair. But I really do think they enjoy it. In fact, I had one class last year that they signed a piece of paper that they wrote. They called the Bill of Chapel because they didn't think I was taking them to the chapel enough. They found it that peaceful, which is very cool. So for us too, we feel and sense that deeper peace, that interior peace when we're there in the chapel and when we're there with Jesus in the Eucharist. And I think sometimes, we can say to ourselves, I'm not going to make a decision. I do this all the time, unfortunately. But maybe I shouldn't say all the time, but sometimes I think to myself, I'm not going to make a decision on something until I know for sure, right? Or I understand it for sure. And so we can have that same temptation about, let's say you take Eucharistic adoration. We can say, I know this is what we believe, and so I go to Mass and I receive communion. But in going to Eucharistic adoration, if I don't fully understand it, then maybe you don't think of this consciously, but this could be a subconscious thing. Until I fully grasp it, fully understand it, maybe I'm not going to go more often. So it's this aspect of faith when you go in there, right? That you're living on faith. You're faith-seeking understanding. That cycle of faith-seeking understanding. Okay, I understand it a little bit more, and now let me take more steps in faith. It's not about understanding things 100% or having guarantees, and we live in this world and this culture that wants to have guarantees and understand things 100% before moving forward. We don't want to have mistakes. We don't want to have to, be hurt or to learn or to struggle. Okay. I guess just a couple other things here. Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, he really a pretty inspirational life he lived. He was very devoted to the Eucharist. He exemplified this idea of working and praying, like ora et labora, work and prayer. It's signified very well by Mary and Martha. There's so many interesting things that we can miss when we go back and read different parts of the Bible. So Martha was the worker, Mary was the one that was more the prayer. Both are good and important. It's kind of like justice and mercy, right? Work is good. Prayer is better. Jesus says, Martha, Mary has chosen the better part, right? But what's interesting about that story is that Martha was the one that meets Jesus. Martha is the one that first meets Jesus when he comes into town, and she leaves him. It's not like she was busy working and she didn't know Jesus was there. She's the one that meets Jesus, and then she leaves to go work, right? And then Mary is there with Jesus. And so how often do we leave Jesus to do something less important? Right? And that's often, for people of good conscience, this is a struggle for me, and maybe for you too, is the devil tries to tempt us with lesser goods, right? If he can't tempt you with right away doing something terrible, right? Then he's like, well, if I can just get you to do lesser good. Work's good. Why don't you focus on work instead of prayer, instead of Jesus, right? The work is, I can see the benefit, right? I can see the benefit of the work that I'm doing. I helped somebody. If you think about a doctor, we talk about doctors saving lives, and if any of you guys work in the medical field, I go to the hospital. I have a cousin that's a doctor. I have an uncle that was a doctor. I don't have a problem with doctors. Doctors are great. I've been at the hospital before. I don't like going to the doctor, but I'm glad they exist. But doctors, sometimes people say, well, you saved my life, doc. We're still going to die. They helped you. They're elongating your life, right? But they didn't save our life like Jesus saves our life. Right? But sometimes we can think of, we can kind of use verbiage that's not quite 100% accurate, that's close. Even how we judge ourselves, right? We can be close, but we can be off, right? The more we grow in holiness, the worse we see our sins. So the more we're realizing how inaccurate we are at really being good judges. Okay, or maybe the more we grow in faith, what's the saying? The more you know you don't know, right? So a couple things about Blessed Pier Giorgio with Eucharistic adoration. He would often, in the middle of the night, it was routine for him to go to Eucharistic adoration. He was a member of the University Student Adoration Society, which is really cool that they have that. I hope that there's some university somewhere that have things like that today, maybe at a Catholic university. He was assigned the second Saturday of the month at the church that he was, which is very cool. Out of concern for his health, an interesting story, his mother tried to hide the flyers advertising the all-night adoration times and places that were sent to their home, but nothing could stop him. Even at 19 years old, with an active student life, from getting to adoration as often as possible, he considered a privilege to stand guard regularly in this way with the King of Kings. And so just one last, I guess I'll maybe end here a few minutes early, but one last thought that, actually two last thoughts I was going to share. One is a saying, which is that life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. I think that was Soren Kierkegaard, although, and that might be the only thing I know about him, is his name, that he said that. No, I think we look at life so often as full of these different problems to solve, right? I'm hungry, that's a problem, how do I solve it? I eat some food. I have a bill to pay, that's a problem, how do I solve it? I need to make some money. I have a health problem, I need to go to the doctor, right? And death is a problem for us. How do I, and we need a solution to that. Jesus solves that for us. But life isn't a problem, right? It's not an accumulation of all these different problems, and so life's not a problem, right? It's a mystery. Our faith is a mystery. And we tend to, even in the church, we live in a world and a society that's dominated by probably the rationality and the thinking. And sometimes we can do that in the church, especially because what we believe makes so much more sense than anything else, right? We have a great explanation, description, answer to any question anybody has about anything, right? And so we can do the same thing. But you see all these different examples of things that maybe don't make quite so much sense, right? There's a couple different examples of this. One, you think of martyrdom. You think about St. Maximilian Kolbe is a great story of where he takes the place of another man in a concentration camp, but he could have died for anybody, right? He could have probably died for other people in that camp, right? So why this guy? Why this guy and not somebody else? I think there's a phrase of the scandal of the particular, like this idea of the uniqueness of some of these things that happen in life. Another example, oh no, I just lost it. Oh no. I thought it was a good one too. Maybe it'll come back to me. Oh no, what was I just... Oh no. Okay. Another thing here, to look at prayer, and this was from Bishop Barron. It's nice to quote Bishop Barron because he quotes all these other people, and so you can quote him quoting other people. I like to do that. I do that a lot when I teach, and he's probably helped me every year that I've been teaching. And so he was quoting someone. He said that it's not so much that we have a relationship with God as that we are in a relationship with God, that we are a relationship. We are a relationship. So our very existence, whether people pray or not, right, or their very existence, they exist in relation to God, thanks to God, right? And so it's a good way to think of, instead of like I'm bigger than God, and so I have a relationship with God, it's more like God's bigger than me, right? And so it's a good way, I think, to think of prayer. It's more this recognition of the fact that we're recognizing God exists. He's all good. He's all loving. He created us. He deserves our love. And it's about right order. And it's another thing Bishop Barron talks about, this idea of right order and right praise. And he talks about Adam. I don't know if you've heard this analogy of Adam before the fall. He's this idea of the first priest and the first king, which is so beautiful. And so Jesus is the high priest, Jesus is the high king. But Adam, before the fall, is this first priest where he takes all of creation, he names creation, he gathers creation in adoration of God. And worship and praise of God. And what is sin? Sin is bad praise. And so our life, we need to continue to focus on good praise. And that is what Eucharistic adoration is. And it's going to bother me so much what that other example was. Maybe it wasn't, it's probably in here somewhere. Well, thank you all. Hopefully that was helpful in some way. It was helpful for me in just writing this and reflecting on this. So